Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about religion and falsity with Joel Grus, author of Your Religion is False. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Joel Grus is the author of perhaps the most hilarious of the new atheist books, Your Religion is False. As marginal revolution blogger and previous guest on this show, Tyler Cowan said of the book, he will tell you your religion is false. Joel, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Now, I wouldn't normally pick up a book disproving religions, not because I'm religious. It's actually quite the opposite. I grew up completely without religion. I've never had a God-related thought. It's sort of like I'd be more likely generally to pick up a book disproving Batman. But in this case, there's the humor to it. It totally sells me on it. Now, were you intending to write first and foremost an atheist book and then make it humorous, or you wanted to write a humor book and atheism happened to be a subject for you?
I would say it's more of the second. I was actually working on a novel when I kind of discovered I had absolutely no talent for writing fiction. And around the same time, I picked up John Hodgman's first book, The Areas of My Expertise, which is kind of a humor book about everything. And it kind of had a deep influence on me. And I said, that's the kind of book that I want to write. And I want to write about religion. Therefore, I kind of just put the two together.
It is interesting you bring up John Hodgman's book because I didn't really think to make the comparison, but you do share a certain... how to put this, but you'll know this better than I will. A humor style that involves making a lot of stuff up.
Right. Exactly.
Is that primarily what you took from Hodgman, or what were the lessons he had for you in that book?
That was part of it. I think I had already learned that lesson a little bit through blogging, just in the course of relating events about my life. They'd always become a little bit funnier if I would throw in something that maybe could have happened but didn't. And from Hodgman, I would say I took the idea that, you know what, you can take that concept and make a really funny book out of it.
Now, this is actually kind of a new thing for atheist books, if I can make that into a genre, because when I have sort of been exposed to text from the more mainstream ones, they do tend to... They have a certain humorlessness that's like they sometimes think they're funny, but it's like when a teacher makes a joke. It's not ha-ha funny necessarily, but they're also very careful not to include anything that could perhaps be even somewhat perceived as a falsity. You go the other way. You have arguments that make sense, but they are littered with references to the Olsen twins, MC Scat Cat, Krippendorf's tribe, Captain Caveman, and Krista McAuliffe, things that may or may not be real.
Right. Part of that is just kind of the way I think about the world. Whenever events happen, I always end up relating them to pop culture, possibly because I watched too much TV when I was growing up.
It is a certain very specific area of pop culture, too. You can nail down a year-to-year window, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much anything that came on TBS probably between 1983 and 1989 is probably the bulk of it.
You'd call it a very TBS-centric sense of humor.
Well, I grew up in Atlanta where TBS was a local station, so it probably had a deeper influence on me than on most people.
Now, this is also, in a lot of ways, a more ambitious book than many books that seem to want to disprove religion, because those focus on the big three. They'll focus on Christianity, Judaism, Islam. When did it come to you, or how did it come to you, to take on pretty much every religion you could find evidence of existing or having once existed?
I think a lot of the motivation for that was not so much to go out to people and say, hey, you guys who are down there on Tonga worshiping giant stone heads, you guys are doing something that's not real. It was more with the goal of, all right, Christians, Jews, Muslims, the things that you believe are not that different from the things that these other people believe. And I just want to show you as much of a picture as possible by pulling in every religion that I can find out about.
Judging by the title of the book alone, it's fairly clear that you're not gunning straight for the religious audience to convert them to atheism, but do you think that the strategy of putting one religion in context with all these other ones that most or everybody considers to be false already. Is that a superior strategy generally to trying to disprove the individual religion of whoever you're arguing against?
I would be reluctant to call either one a superior strategy. I think that it totally depends on who you're talking to. Some people would find one method more persuasive. Some people would probably find the other.
Is there a quality of a religious person that makes them break toward one side or the other of that divide in your experience?
I would look at it as how they reached their religious beliefs. Someone who's probably been brought up believing the same thing since birth and sort of has never really questioned it, they might react more positively or maybe more negatively to someone who actually sits down and says, here's why the specific things you believe are problematic. Whereas someone who is maybe more of a searcher and said, I dabbled in Buddhism and I dabbled in Kabbalah and I tried Scientology, that person might be more open to the idea of, well, let's look at all these things they have in common, and a lot of them don't make sense.
Outside of the world of publishing in quote-unquote real life, are you or have you been the guy who eagerly engages religious people, friends, acquaintances in arguments about this sort of thing? Or are your efforts to prove religion's falsity limited mostly to the written word?
I wouldn't say that I'm evangelical in any sense. What I would say is that if people engage with me on the topic, then I won't pull any punches. I spent several years sharing an office with a very devout Christian whose mission was to convert me to Christianity. And so once she opened that door, I sort of felt like I had the liberty to attack pretty much everything she believed. But if she hadn't started that, I probably wouldn't have brought it up.
How much is it possible to maintain? I mean, it sounds like a type of relationship, working or otherwise, I don't normally hear of. But when you start getting into that dialogue, that's sort of a running dialogue with somebody, they're trying to bring you into a fold, and you're trying to disprove their beliefs. I can't even imagine, how does that stay on cordial terms?
Part of it is that, as you can tell from the book, I don't take much of anything that seriously. So when she wants to drag me to a Bible study, or when she gets angry at my swearing or anything like that, I tend to take it in a lighthearted way and will joke back with her. The other thing is that, surprisingly, on non-religious issues, she and I saw very eye to eye in a way that most of our other colleagues did not. So despite the fact that she was a very devout Jesus believer and I was not, we had some real deep kind of philosophical similarities. So I think that also helped us stay friends despite all these disagreements.
This reminds me of something I've seen happen quite a bit in my own life and others, where someone will profess devout religious belief, and I mean, by definition then it's different from me because I don't really have any, but they won't, that devout belief won't correlate to any other underlying philosophical differences, if you know what I mean. It kind of weirds me out that sometimes someone who is a devout believer is not more different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at day-to-day life, we were very different. She didn't drink. She wasn't into premarital sex. There were all sorts of things that, like, socially, she would not do that I would do, and vice versa. But in terms of political views and just in terms of thinking about the way organizations could sensibly run themselves, we tended to see very eye to eye.
Was the goal to prove religion's falsity one that was with you early on in life? Were you a little kid doing this as well, or was there some sort of Rubicon you crossed to become that?
When I was a little kid, I would describe myself as being a skeptical believer. I believed because everyone around me did, but it kind of never really made sense to me. And so I always questioned, why are we doing this? This doesn't seem right. It wasn't until college when I really kind of became comfortable with my non-belief. And I would say it really wasn't until a few years after that where I became kind of an active proponent of it. I have a handful of kind of pet topics, and religion is one of them. So it sort of was a natural choice to make a book out of.
Now, how does religion fit into this handful of pet topics? Are they connected in any sort of web, or they just happen to be your own particular, what will set you off?
I don't know that they're connected. Most of the other ones are more economics related. And if I wanted to stretch it, I could probably draw parallels between them. But there are a number of people, as I've said before, who would agree with me on all the economic stuff and think I'm way out of left field on the religion. And just the opposite is even, I would say, more true. As part of writing this book, I've gotten more involved with atheist communities and atheist bloggers and atheist Twitterers. And I find that some of the economics that comes out of these people, I kind of have to hold my tongue.
Now, this is interesting, this correlation that you've witnessed, because, yeah, I've also seen it happen. I mean, I don't tend to frequent a lot of atheist societies or atheist forums, but when I do hear them expound on subjects that are not atheism, there is, I don't, how would you describe the way that these people think when they think about other stuff?
It's interesting in that their skepticism seems to be very, what I would say, confined to issues of religion. So if someone makes a grandiose religious claim, they say, oh, come on, that's an extraordinary claim. It requires extraordinary evidence. But if someone were to make a sort of similarly grandiose claim in the political or economic arena, they tend to accept it a little bit unthinkingly, which I've always found a little bit weird. There are a few prominent atheists who I would say tend more to the libertarian politics, people like Michael Shermer, people like Penn and Teller, and if anything, they tend to get a lot of vitriol heaped on them from most of the atheist community.
What are some of the wackier things you've found that the atheist community, if we can treat this as a whole, believes politically and economically that they switch off their skepticism for?
A couple days ago, the CEO of Whole Foods wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal about his ideas for healthcare reform. They were very different from what's being proposed right now, but they were, for the most part, pretty sensible suggestions. Things like uncoupling your healthcare from your employment and making it so you can buy healthcare across state lines. But because he was against the Obama plan and the Democratic Congress plan, my atheist Twitter feed is just crawling with people who are going to boycott Whole Foods because their CEO wrote this piece that they don't like.
Why would the atheist community have a consistent, and you're arguing, mistaken belief about these sorts of things? I mean, why are they wrong sort of in common like that?
I think part of it is that what are traditionally considered more conservative ideas are associated by a lot of these people with religious people. I mean, if you look at the Republican Party, people stereotypically think that's the party where the religious right is and all the Christian people are, and they're trying to take away the right to an abortion, and they're trying to take away sex education, and they want to spend money on faith-based programs. And so I think there's a lot of that which shuts people out from even considering the ideas, even when they're proposing good ideas. So
might we say that their atheism is so strong that it, in a way, that skepticism in that area just kind of it taints other areas of thought with reverse skepticism? That's certainly true for some of them. I mean, some of them also really are true believers about, say, socialism. And some of them, I think, give a lot more time to thinking about religious issues than they do to thinking about politics issues, just because that's their interest. And so they tend to go with the flow more. Now, to take the inverse, where we mentioned earlier that occasionally you'll encounter people who are religious who don't happen to turn on a lot of skepticism in that area, but is it that they do have skepticism when they think about politics, economics, that sort of thing, or do you think they're sort of following what they're supposed to believe because of their religiosity? I've seen both. I mean, I think there's probably much more of the second, who think this is what people at church believe, so this is what I'm going to believe. But my friend who I mentioned before, she was very, very skeptical about politics, about economics. We would read the news together, and she would have kind of the same cynical take on what was really going on that I would. And I always did find it a little bit amazing that she couldn't take this skepticism and apply it elsewhere in her life. Now, where do you go if you want full 360-degree skepticism? Is there some club for that? No, and I don't mean to be claiming that I'm a full 360-degree skeptic. I'm sure that I have blinkers that I don't know about, that someone is going to point to me and say, you're not really being objective about this. But as I've said, the people
who've most impressed me along those lines are people like Michael Shermer, people like Penn and Teller. I myself am not a member of any atheist organizations. I've just been kind of tangentially involved with atheist blogs and atheist Twitters and things like that.
Now, you mentioned Michael Shermer, publisher of Skeptic Magazine. He's actually a former guest on this show as well. Very cool guy. And you have a quote in the acknowledgments, I believe, of your book with him attributing to him the phrase that your religion is false, would not be published by a reputable publisher. Is that something he actually said?
Yeah. So when I was trying to find a literary agent back when I was first working on the book, most of them weren't returning my emails or calls, and I got in touch with one through a friend of mine who read a few chapters and said, I don't think I can sell this. So I emailed Michael Shermer to ask him for his help, and he wrote back and basically said, I kind of extracted the unkindest part of it. It was a nice email, but he basically said, you know what, there are so many books on this topic out there, unless you're like really famous or a Nobel Prize winning scientist, no reputable publisher is going to be interested in this.
So faced with that, I mean, this takes me right into a topic I wanted to definitely discuss, which is it combines the sort of not standard, but the normal struggle a first-time author encounters to get published, but also the even greater struggle compounded when you're making fun of all religions. Now, where did you go, or I guess let's move a little before this all. I mean, what was the turning point where you said, I've got to make this into a book. I've got to make this John Hodgman-style ridiculing of religion into an actual printed ink and paper book?
I just started writing down an outline, and once I got the outline down not on paper, but in Microsoft Word, I looked at it and I said, that could actually be a pretty interesting book, a book that I would like to read if I weren't the one writing it. And so I just started fleshing it out, and I wrote the introduction first, and I was very happy with the introduction, which I think is now called the preface. And I just said, you know what, if I can continue this pace for another 200-something pages, that'll be a book, and it'll be a great book.
The contrast in form between, say, as you mentioned, blogging, making people laugh like that, and doing it in a long form, that's got to have a fairly steep learning curve to it. I mean, it can't be, it's got to be deceptively similar, but not similar enough to actually be fully translatable skills.
The most difficult part of the transition for me was that in a blog, you can use hyperlinks to explain your joke. So you want to make a really obscure joke, you just hyperlink it to the Wikipedia page for what you're talking about, and people will click on it, and then they can say, that's what he's talking about. In a book, you don't have any of that. And so I expect that if you weren't reading the book, sitting next to Wikipedia and looking stuff up, you would miss half the jokes. And that was just kind of a decision that I made that, you know what, that's the way it's going to be, and I can deal with that.
We have gotten into an age of, and I mean, I really do, these jokes you mentioned, these hyperlink jokes where, I mean, my favorite form is essentially, and I mean, this is going to kill any form of humor that it sounds like it has by explaining it, but where you describe something and then you link to the page, you make that description into a hyperlink to the page of what that thing is, and thus, bam, comedy. I wouldn't even know how to live without that, but you do mention Wikipedia and your great debt to Jimbo Wales in that same acknowledgement section. Now, I imagine the research process for this did involve hundreds and hundreds of hours just pounding obscure religious facts on Wikipedia and elsewhere. Would I be correct in that assumption?
Yeah, I would say so. Hundreds of hours. That sounds right.
But what kind of endurance does this require? Because you get into some obscure religions that haven't been practiced for maybe ever. I mean, how would you describe the research effort for this book and the sort of what it took to plow through all this stuff?
Well, it turns out that surfing the web in general and looking things up on Wikipedia in particular is something that I have a particular aptitude for. Like, that doesn't seem like work to me. I love leafing through Wikipedia and just reading random articles. So that part was actually, I would say, the easiest part. The harder part was saying, all right, of this, what am I going to use and how am I going to use it? But the research itself was actually the part that I found a lot of fun.
Did you find that you had to come to a point where you fully, to the extent that it's possible, grasped all of these religions you talk about in the book before you could make fun of them? Or was it more the case that a lot of them didn't really make much sense on their faces, and thus you could go ahead and just move forward with the ridicule.
I think what you'll find is that some of the religions are covered in much more depth than others, and it's probably fair to say those are the ones that I got into and tried to understand better. There's a chapter on indigenous religions of Africa, and I think each of those is summed up with a sentence. So clearly I didn't really go into depth and try and understand what is the Bushango religion like. I just found one fact from it that I can make fun of. Whereas the Catholicism chapter is actually, it's a good 10 pages. And it so happens that independent of this book, I've just been listening to the local Catholic radio station on my commute for like the last year, 2 years. So I've picked up a lot about it that way.
And Seattle is not normally a city that I would think of as a great basis for a Catholic radio station, but it really has one, huh?
It's called EWTN. It's actually a national network of Catholic radio stations. And so they just have a local instance of it on AM radio. And they do have a few local interest shows like the Seattle Archbishop's Hour and things like that. I don't know how many people listen to it. Everyone I know thinks it's very weird that I listen to it. But
and how much exposure did you do of yourself to these sort of, we'll call them, I mean, there was, on the one hand, you were reading Wikipedia, getting the facts such as they are about these religions, but then there's also the exposure to the sources of information meant for true believers. I mean, you went to the Catholic radio station, you heard that every day, but where else did your research take you as far as stuff meant for people who do believe?
So, I mean, throughout the course of my life, I've been to different religious services for one reason or another, weddings or things like that. I actually spent a while dating a girl who was kind of I'd call her a soft Methodist. I'm not sure what she believed, but she liked going to church, so I went with her a few times. And I found the experience pretty distasteful, but I feel like I learned a lot about what it was to be a liberal Protestant from those mornings I was there.
It does seem like, from reading your book, you, maybe not necessarily just you personally, but that in the vast majority, at least in the developed world, or at least in America, we'll confine it to this country, what you encounter is a lot fewer of the hard religious types and more of the ones who, as you said, you're not sure what they believe and maybe they're not sure themselves. Does that better characterize the religious you run across in the U.S.?
I think so. I think you have the hardliners out there, but especially in Seattle, you get a lot of people who sort of, I go to church, I like going there, my friends are there, it's a pleasant way to spend an hour, but they don't get real deep into the theology of, all my friends are going to hell because they're not saved.
It's more of a religion as social club phenomenon, you see?
That's part of it. I think it's more than that. I think most of these people do believe that there's some kind of God out there, and that maybe some of the things in the Bible are true, but not all of them, and probably the ones that bug me the most, those are the ones that aren't true, and the ones that I like, those are the ones that are true.
And this is something you get into in the book, because it's fairly easy to say that one is unbothered by this sort of the people who sort of pick and choose and are in and of themselves harmless with their religion. But if I have this correct in the book, you argue that they do provide, as a whole, something of a mask for those who are extreme. Correct?
Yeah, I don't think that's their intention. But I think that what happens is if someone comes out and says Jesus wants us to kill abortionists, then you end up forced into the position of saying that's not what Jesus wants, rather than there's no such thing as Jesus, therefore you're wrong.
When writing the book, then, how much did you oscillate? Because I imagine there was a little bit of oscillation, at least, between seriously trying to go for an argument to take something down, or just going for more the ridicule that would sort of do the job itself.
Part of my idea, and this hasn't happened so much, was that I could state something where here are 5 true outrageous facts and 3 made-up outrageous facts about some religion, and someone comes back and says, what? 6, 7, and 8, those aren't even true, and sort of implicitly accept, oh, well, but the first 5 are.
So there's this putting up of the super ridiculous alongside the ridiculous and believed.
Exactly. I mean, that's also, I would say, almost a different form of joke, where They use it in all sorts of movies and sitcoms, how dare you do A, B, C, and D? And they're like, what? I would never do C.
Yes, exactly. The sort of putting the one, I mean, real is not the word we're looking for, but you have the one target and you embed it in a series of fake targets. I don't know the best word for this. Perhaps you have a more concise description of this strategy.
Well, the other piece was that I tried as far as possible to make the fake targets at least plausible. I mean, maybe there are people out there who believe these things. Not everyone, but it's conceivable that someone might think this.
Now, I have to wonder, do you picture your religion as false getting into the hands of someone who is religious? Because I have a hard time imagining someone who believes in any of the religions in the book picking up a book called that in the first place. Or maybe it's more like they'll pick it up and think, well, sure, all these other religions are false, but that sort of thing.
I went back and forth on that about, do I give it this really provocative title that is kind of in your face and people might be really turned off by it, but that really might catch other people's eye? Or do I find something, kind of safer but less interesting? And I finally decided that probably a bigger risk was that the book just sort of slipped through the cracks.
Yeah.
I would rather people see it and say, oh, I can't read a book with that title, than not see it at all.
Well, you'd also want them to see the lovely cover illustration, Weekend at Jesus's.
Well, of course. I actually spent a fair amount of the time that I was supposed to be writing the book, trying to figure out what to put on the cover.
When did the Weekend at Bernie's inspiration strike?
That actually struck a long time ago. When I was in college, I did a stand-up comedy act, and one of the jokes in it was basically a joke about Jesus' resurrection being a Weekend at Bernie's style comedy. And so in the end, I just kind of pulled that idea out of my head and stuck it on paper. Specifically
by dressing the figures in the painting as Andrew McCarthy and Jonathan Silverman.
Yeah, no, I worked from a picture of the movie cover.
Now, you mentioned, we talked a little bit ago about how provocative you wanted to make the book, and you have a quote from George Bernard Shaw in there at the very beginning, that the secret of success is to offend the greatest number of people. Now, is this a formula you have found has been borne out in your life? Has it worked for you before on a smaller scale?
Depends how you define success. It hasn't made me rich or famous, but it certainly gets more people to listen to me and to think about what I'm talking about. So in that sense, I'd have to say yes.
I do wonder about that, because I do go back and forth in my own mind. I think, is it better to be the guy who draws attention with outrageous statements, or is it better to be the slow-acting poison pill that you cut up into food? The guy who seems inoffensive, but actually, when he's already past your defenses, he lets loose. But I'm guessing that latter strategy is not one that you consider to be effective.
I don't know that I would say it's not effective. I would say it's just less my style.
When you're in the course of writing this book, I want to get an idea of what you figured the existing landscape of atheist books was missing. I mean, what's your opinion of the books recently out in the last few years by the Hitchenses and the Dawkinses and the Dennett's of the world? So
here's where I have to confess that I haven't read most of those books.
I see.
I've read earlier Dennett books. I've read earlier Dawkins books. And I'm a big fan of both men. I didn't read either of their books on religion, only because I didn't think I was going to learn a whole lot from them. I did read the Hitchens book because I'm a big fan of his, and I knew that even if I already knew everything he was going to say in the book, he was going to say it in kind of a very clever and mean and sardonic way that I would enjoy, which ended up being the case.
I don't know if it even rises to the level of necessarily a trend, but there do seem to be more popular atheist books out nowadays than there have been before. I mean, is this a heartening thing to you in general, or not even have you read the books and can critique them, but do you think this is the type of strategy, the books that aren't yours, do you think they've taken a tack in the public mind that works to promote the cause of atheism?
In terms of promoting it to people who are sort of not inclined to consider it anyway? No. But in terms of kind of sending a message to people who might be harboring these thoughts in private, but not doing anything about them because they think that, everyone around me believes, therefore that must be the right thing to do. I think the bigger value is probably in giving support to those kind of people. Now that we're talking about these other books, the one difference that I am remembering that I was thinking about was that the Hitchens book was How Religion Poisons Everything. And the Sam Harris book was Here's the Awful Things That Religion Does. And I didn't want to write a book about here's why religion is bad, because I know lots of religious people that I like, and maybe it does good in their lives. Instead, I wanted to take the approach, it may be good, it may be bad, but it's not true. And that's what my book is about. It's not true. You can keep doing all these things, but just realize that they're not true.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can find our website and the complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Joel Grus, author of Your Religion is False. It is a very refreshingly and surprisingly simple angle. Simply, your religion is false. That's not a hugely complicated premise, but it is a very meaningful one. Now, I suppose the first thing that came to my mind when I heard the title was I thought of religious people who say, who would say, tough because my religion isn't amenable to your human logic. Any argument that makes sense to me against religion is actually just the devil, because the devil's had a lot of practice tricking all of us, and he knows all the right arguments. And I mean, there's a lot of defenses built up that how to put this, that kind of forbid logic at all. Truth and falsity are not even ideas considered. How big an obstacle do you think that is?
I think those people, one, they're probably not going to read the book. But two, I think the sort of people who think that way are going to be the people that end up at the real extremes and not in this sort of soft middle that we were talking about before.
So as we discussed a bit earlier, this idea of it's talked about seemingly fairly often in atheist circles, the idea of the people on the fence who maybe call themselves religious or nominally consider themselves to be religious, but are, shall we say, vulnerable to a book like Your Religion is False, in that they're, at least in some practical sense, open to believing what you have to say in it. Are they, you think, the primary or the only area the converting atheist should be working on?
No, it's interesting. I don't think of myself as a converting atheist. And that's a strange thing to say given that I've written this book. But I'm not out there, going into churches and saying, you guys need to stop believing. It's really people who pick up this book and enjoy it. I don't think that the converting atheism, the way you call it, is a good strategy. And I know there's a lot of people who are involved in that. To me, it doesn't seem like a great use of my time.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because before reading your book, or before reading any book, it's not just yours, before getting information about any book that has to do with atheism or with disproving religion and what have you, there's the, and I'm sure you've encountered this in atheist circles online and such, but there is the stigma of what I'll call the YouTube atheist, of the guys who are just so aggressive and so kind of violently seeming to pound their head against the wall. Ultimately, I always fear that every atheist-related material I'm going to read or watch will be just another act of that, be another angry, kind of chunky 18-year-old on YouTube saying, why do all you stupid people believe in religions? Because clearly it's wrong. Now, that never seemed to be a particularly effective strategy to me, but it seems to be, I guess, does it just play well among other atheists?
I think you see the same phenomenon in any kind of true believer subculture. So when you go to some sort of progressive organization, they'll do the same thing. Maybe not with YouTube videos, but they get just as fired up. If you go to, a Young Republicans conference, they'll get fired up too. any group that comes together around some sort of ideology, people like to think they're right, and they like to show off that they're right.
Of course, you have the chapter in your book that deals with the assertion, which you say is false, that atheism itself is a religion. And I've never found that particularly convincing myself, that atheism is its own religion. But there is that, I don't know if that's a religious element, but it's just a true believer is a decent word for it, but it shares something with religion, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I would characterize what it shares is zealotry. And you can see there must be some sort of human desire to be zealous, because people get zealous about their sports teams, they get zealous about their favorite politicians, they get zealous about which kind of pickup truck they drive. People kind of like forming tribes that way.
Now, I want to get into a few of the religions that one wouldn't necessarily expect to find in your book. First of all, Dungeons and Dragons is listed as a religion in your book. How did that come about? How did that get inclusion?
A lot of times you meet people who are really into Dungeons and Dragons, and sometimes they take it a little bit too seriously. And part of it was inspired by this Tom Hanks movie, Mazes and Monsters, from like 1983 or something, where he goes mentally ill and he really thinks that he's playing this Dungeons and Dragons game. And I just kind of thought, well, if he can believe it, then other people could believe it too. And a number of the components of Dungeons and Dragons, here's the god that my character follows, and I'm going to pray to them, and I'm going to kill all these orcs in their name. And a lot of the things that happen in that world have obvious parallels to things that are religious and happen in the real world.
I meet a lot of people who play or have played Dungeons and Dragons or associated games, and they will call themselves atheists, but they go into this, they put themselves regularly into this fantasy world that seems to me to be ultra-religious. Every religious thing, every religious type of thing that has been asserted to happen in real life but hasn't, actually happens in these games on a regular basis, and they just play them. I always wonder about that.
I went through the phase when I was 15, and I played a little bit, and I haven't thought much about it since, except in writing the book. But I know I have friends who are, 30 years old, and they still get together on weekends and roll dice and play characters and worship and all that stuff.
Now, in a section that's probably going to, or at least potentially could, get you more angry emails than anything else in the book, you call objectivism a religion. Now, your analysis does make me come to agree with that, but how did you come to find objectivism to be religious?
Mostly because I know lots of objectivists, and they tend to objectivism, as it's typically, I would say, practiced, which is also a religious word, tends to take a lot of assertions and claim that they're sort of self-evident and non-disprovable. So, living an egoistic life is the only moral way to go through the world, and altruism is inherently bad. And any time you make a statement like this, to me, it has the flavor of a religious statement, like adultery is bad, or to me, the parallels were pretty strong. And the other thing is that the story that's in the book about my college roommate who sort of fell into the throes of objectivism, that story is about half true. One of my college roommates actually did do that. In our junior year, he kind of joined the Ayn Rand Society, and he'd come home every day and start lecturing us about the virtues of selfishness and this and that, and he was behaving like a religious zealot.
What do you think grabs these people about objectivism? I mean, there's the tribe-building instinct we've discussed, but it takes it to a whole new level. When I meet a new objectivist, like you describe your roommate being, I'm always surprised by the extent to which they have embraced Rand and the speed with which they've embraced Rand.
Many of her books are pretty good propaganda for 17-year-olds. I mean, I read Atlas Shrugged when I was about that age, and I really liked it. And I didn't get into objectivism or anything, but I remember thinking, wow, she makes a lot of really good points. And I think it's very easy to cross the line from she makes good points to I accept what John Galt says about my moral purpose, and I'm going to start teaching everyone what I've learned because it's been so profound an influence in my life.
Now, the effect of objectivism specifically on 17-year-olds. I know marketers long to capture that demographic. How do you think Rand did it?
Every 17-year-old sort of thinks that they're so smart and all the adults who won't let them have their way are kind of holding them back. And I think that's a little bit of the message of some of her work is that, what you're doing for yourself, that's right. And look at all these moochers and looters who are trying to stand in your way. And I think that resonates a lot with that age group.
There's another religion in here that it sounds like you've had a lot of experience encountering in your own life. It's non-religious spirituality. What is that exactly?
Well, you'll meet a lot of people and they'll say, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. There's a joke in there about so many people choosing that on Match.com. But it's also the case that you just, at least in Seattle, you go out and people will say, oh, you wrote a book about religion? Well, I'm not religious. I'm more spiritual. And I would ask them, what's the difference? What does it mean that you're not religious but you're spiritual? And I would never get anything but really wishy-washy answers.
What do you think is driving that? I mean, it never had occurred to me it would never occur to me to call myself something like that, but it seems to be so common these days. I mean, in the book you do talk about how they don't want to be ridiculed for being religious, but they also don't want to not be religious. What is that?
I think that's part of it. It's some of it is fear. It can be a scary thing to think, you know what? There's nothing else out there. This world is what there is, and this life is the one that you get. And so I think a lot of people who aren't raised to believe that are understandably reluctant to accept that as a conclusion. And so I think that a lot of the spirituality is kind of a way of grasping onto this hope that maybe there is something more. And so, I'm not going to believe that the Bible is true or that the Quran is true or that the Vedas are true, but I can still cling hope to the idea that there's some force out there or some power, and maybe after I die something will happen.
People often get angry at me when I admit to them that I don't believe in energy.
Any kind of energy?
Quote unquote energy. You've
right.
heard this energy invoked. You just it's like the last bastion of the religious of the spiritual but not religious person. They fall back on energy, don't they? Every time.
You get things like that. When I lived in LA, I used to go to parties and I'd meet people who were Reiki practitioners, and I would have a real hard time having a civil conversation with them because they're like, I'd say, well, so what is that? They say, oh, well, I adjust people's chi energy to make them healthier. Not by touching them, but just by waving my hands around their head. So then I started asking them questions like, well, can you do it backwards and make them less healthy? And they just get mad.
Now, it seems like at the root of a lot of these quasi-religions, or perhaps even of the religions, it looks to boil down to a desire to act as if whatever you want to be true is true.
I don't know that I would agree with that.
Ah, okay.
If you think about how religious people behave, a lot of the prescriptions that are put on them are kind of unpleasant things. So, it says no premarital sex because that's what the Bible says. And I don't know that people are out there thinking, I want premarital sex to be wrong. I don't know people are out there, Catholics are out there thinking, I want masturbation to be a sin. So because of things like that, I don't know that I buy that.
With the amount of picking and choosing that goes on, I mean, even just picking what you want to follow out of the Bible and what you don't, that's sort of a form of modifying, kind of home modifying a religion to suit whatever you happen to want to follow. I realize that for example, the premarital sex thing, that it is professed to be unpleasant, but I don't know, maybe some of them actually don't want it. I'm not quite sure, but there does seem to be a huge amount of customization, if you know what I mean.
It's possible. I think there's a lot less customization than you'd see if your description were the case. The customization, I think, is also, get the impression it's more of an American phenomenon than it is in other places.
There does seem to be some amount of exceptionalism, as it were, for the way Americans approach their religion. I mean, for example, does Jubu exist outside of America?
I think it probably does to some degree. I mean, I'm sure there's got to be some people in Israel who are into Buddhism and some Jewish people in the UK, but I think it's very much kind of a LA phenomenon.
Jubu, we should explain, a cross between Judaism and Buddhism. How widespread is this? I've seen the word actually pop up in a trend piece or two, but I always kind of hope that it's made up.
I have one Facebook friend who lists Jubu as his religion. There is, in Seattle, I know, there's what's called a meditative synagogue, where instead of praying, they sit around and meditate, but at least nominally they're Jewish. So I think it's mostly, as an organized phenomenon, it's pretty isolated, I would guess, to kind of the West Coast, LA, Seattle, maybe San Francisco. And then, you probably get a handful of teenagers elsewhere, some 17-year-old Jewish kid who's like, oh, I'm going to start meditating and doing yoga and all this stuff.
Now, I don't see much official hybridization of Christianity and Buddhism, for example. There's no Jebus that I know of, but what's the affiliation people find between Judaism and Buddhism? Is there any possible affinity there that naturally occurs?
I'll speculate that perhaps as a Jew, you're sort of more of a religious minority to start with, and so you may be more interested in other minority religions. Also, I would say that Judaism is more of a kind of a scholarly religion than some of the Christian religions, so that may also give people more incentive to go out and explore. I mean, there were a bunch of jokes in the book about why that would be the case, but I don't know that I have a good theory on what the connection is.
I have to know, how do you, or I guess I should say the listener should know, because I've read how you got to it, how did you arrive at the conclusion that agnosticism is also false?
The position that people claim as agnostics, it's not possible to know these things. Well, let's take a step back. Agnosticism can either be, I don't know, or it's not possible to know. But people have opinions on all sorts of things that it's not possible to know. I mean, it's not possible to know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, but I still believe that it is. So to say that I can't know for sure whether there's a God, therefore I'm not going to form a belief on it, strikes me as being a cop-out. The other position is that Christianity teaches that if you don't accept Jesus as your Savior, you're going to hell. So if, as an agnostic, you haven't accepted Jesus as your Savior, and you're someone who doesn't want to go to hell, you're sort of implicitly stating a belief about the truth of Christianity. And same about all the other religions that say basically, do X or punishment Y is going to happen to you. Well, if you claim to be an agnostic and you're not doing X and you don't want Y to happen to you, then you kind of don't believe in the religion.
Are you saying that agnosticism is often implicitly defined in the frame of reference of a particular religion? Like when someone says they're agnostic, then they're usually saying they are agnostic about specifically Christianity or about whatever. People don't actually follow up on being agnostic about, for example, every religion, every god in your book?
I would go even stronger than that, which is to say, I don't see how someone could be agnostic towards Christianity. I mean, Christianity at its root consists of the claim, accept Jesus as your Savior, because that's the only way to avoid an eternity of torment in hell. So to the extent you don't accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, I would have to argue that you implicitly don't believe in Christianity. And you can call yourself an agnostic, but to me, you've already taken a stand by saying, I don't believe that punishment that you promised me is actually going to happen to me.
This applies then mostly to religions of which there is a broad awareness of the consequences of not believing in their gods. I mean, people tend to know, in America anyway, generally what Christianity says will happen if you don't believe in that particular god. But if you don't believe in one of the more obscure island or voodoo or Korean gods, people would have a hard time being actually agnostic about that, wouldn't they? Because there's no way that unless they grew up in that tradition, they could actually be aware of what.
Yeah, I mean, I would say less agnostic. They're just simply not even aware of those things. I mean, it's hard to have an opinion on whether something is true if you've never even heard of it.
There's another system of belief, I'll say, in the book that I was fascinated to see you frame as a religion, which is belief in what's increasingly invoked as the technological singularity, or as you call it in the book, singularitarianism. Now, when did that strike you as being a religious way of thinking?
I have a lot of friends who are really into singularity type groups, members of the Singularity Institute. They go to conferences, and I actually went to one of these conferences about 7 years ago, mostly to socialize with my friends, but I saw these talks, and Robert Wright gave a talk there back when he was promoting his book Non-Zero about the benefits of cooperation and how lots of situations out there are not zero-sum games. And so I had a pretty good question I thought to ask him, but I got stuck in line at the end of his talk behind a bunch of people who were asking questions like, yes, Mr. Wright, when the singularity happens, how will that affect your thesis? And these people were they seemed detached from reality. And over the years, I got to know a few of them. And some of them are my friends, but they have kind of this religious belief that, if I freeze my head after I die, someone's going to figure out how to bring it back to life. And we better prepare for the artificial intelligence because it's going to take over, and the nanobots are going to be the solution to everything. So it's a religion in the sense that it assigns what I would consider really high truth values to things that, to me, are kind of science fiction at this point.
There does seem to be a very eerie parallel. I mean, maybe you've drawn this specific one before, but as I'm envisioning it, between the singularity as it's invoked and, say, a certain type of Christian talking about the rapture, which will come according to the Left Behind books.
I mean, I guess the difference there is that the singularity is going to rescue everybody, whereas the rapture is only going to take the true believers.
It's my understanding that the singularity will rescue everybody unless the gray goo eats us all. But if we've saved our heads, we'll be okay.
Yeah, that's pretty much my understanding of it as well.
Why has this gotten such a hold, at least as I've experienced it? This stuff has taken such a hold among groups online specifically devoted to being logical and rational, and yet they are all about the gray goo and the cryonics and the singularity.
I think that a lot of people see this as kind of a rational path to some of the most desirable claims of religion, living forever and, being in some sort of paradise. And that these are ways that science could conceivably bring us these things in a non-supernatural way. And, if someone says, I want to freeze my head after I die, I don't have a problem with that. I find it very unlikely that they'll ever be brought back to life from that. And the astounding confidence that they have in that feels religious to me.
Having taken on the amount of religions that you do in Your Religion is False, I mean, did this thing come off the presses and you smacked yourself on the head and thought, I forgot one? Or is this your comprehensive stand against religion?
I haven't found any that I forgot. I've found a few minor ones that I didn't know about. Every couple weeks I'll be reading a news article, and I saw one about Noedism, which is basically people who believe that in the Old Testament, God gave Noah a certain set of laws before his covenant with Abraham, and they believe they should live by those laws. So they're not Jews, they're Noahites, and somehow I missed out on that. And there are a few other ones, some obscure Iraqi sect that's been relocated to the U.S., but I feel like I got all the major ones until someone points out otherwise.
Because when John Hodgman was doing his thing, I mean, he had that book, as we mentioned, The Areas of My Expertise, recently followed it up with another book of made-up trivia. It seems like you're going to have to think up a different strategy for the next book you write because you're damn near out of religion.
Oh, yeah, the next book will not be about religion.
What can you tell us about it?
The one I'm working on now is about economics. Hopefully that'll be the one I finish, but it's not very far along at this point.
Economics more straight up, or economics as more through the Hodgman lens?
Can we call it the Grus lens?
Yes, we can. Well, I mean, I put Hodgman in quotes because you've taken it, you've iterated it into a different lens. The Grus lens, sure. What is the Grus lens? We need a definition in these final minutes of the show.
The Grus lens is taking a true topic, embellishing it with outrageous facts, making fun of it, and trying to teach a valuable lesson all throughout.
The subject of economics, is it as rife with misunderstandings as you found religion to be?
the tack of that book is not so much going to be what you believe is false. The economics book hopefully will be more along the lines of, here are the things you should know to be well educated, basically.
It's more of an introduction, something that a Thomas Sowell might write, but through the Grus lens. Sowell through the Grus lens, we'll say.
Sure. That's, let's say, Sowell or maybe Landsberg.
Yeah, I can see. I'm envisioning this already. It's sort of a armchair economist / basic economics / your religion is false kind of unholy triad of influences. I'm liking it already.
We'll see if I can get close. Landsberg is one of my literary heroes. So,
and very much a provocateur. I imagine you enjoy that as well.
Yeah.
The book, once again, is Your Religion is False. Joel Grus, thanks for taking the time to come on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Find our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com and find the producer of our theme music at benalthouse.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.